Woodside record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
Yes, thank you, Senator. My name is Jamie Newlyn. I am the Assistant National Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia. I'll be happy to make a few brief comments. Understand, of course, you have the opening statement in front of you. I'll try not to go over the lot, but just
thanks. There's a lot there. There's a lot to discuss. So over to you, Mr. Newlyn.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the opportunity to the committee to appear before the inquiry. Obviously, we think Australian shipping and maritime industry is a vital component of national transport infrastructure, which is integrated with the functionality and productivity of other industries such as manufacturing, and shipping is obviously an important service industry to manufacturing. In particular, the inputs for manufacturing processes and the outputs for distribution, including for export. And when we talk about inputs, they're generally those bulk commodities required for manufacturing purposes. What we've found, not just through COVID, but generally, is Australia is overly dependent on foreign ships for sea transportation and maritime support needs. There is an urgent need for the nation to mitigate its dependency on foreign shipping in both domestic and international trade, and to build economic advantage from Australia's heavy use of ships and maritime services, given we are an island nation. One pillar of the government's modern manufacturing strategy is to focus on areas of advantage. It is our submission that the shipping and maritime sectors exhibit all the features of national comparative advantage due to the long tradition and provision of shipping and maritime services in Australia, our highly developed freight transport and logistics system, and highly skilled maritime workforce. Another pillar of the manufacturing strategy is to build national resilience for a strong economy, particularly through the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which we support. We propose in our submission that the shipping and maritime components and manufacturing supply chains be integrated into the modern manufacturing strategy, and that key policy initiatives, such as the proposal for a national strategic fleet, the development of maritime hubs associated with the emerging offshore wind energy sector, and port-located hydrogen hubs form part of the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative and can be funded from the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. The need for Australia to reduce its dependency on foreign shipping has again been highlighted, as I indicated earlier, by the disruptions being experienced in global supply chains over the past 6 to 12 months. The recent ACCC container stevedoring monitoring report, which we criticised for the conclusions it drew, nevertheless highlighted a range of anti-competitive, inefficient and disruptive practices exhibited by container shipping lines that deliver inputs to manufacturing processes and transports the nation's manufactured exports to overseas markets. Some of those examples are diversion of services from Australia to higher value routes with higher volumes, omitting port calls to restore schedules, rolling over cargo to later voyages, cancelling bookings, implementation of move count restrictions on vessel exchanges, failing to meet berthing slot windows, creating a cascading impact across the supply chain, and the massively increasing freight rates that cannot be explained by supply and demand factors alone. Is purely price gouging enabled by the near monopoly power of these shipping container lines, and the arbitrary imposition of congestion charges. The use of larger ships then are required in the Australian trade aimed at manipulating port investment strategies and its contracts with stevedoring companies. We believe that one way to mitigate the growing bargaining power of international shipping lines is to increase competition in the freight market. The key to creation of that competitive tension is the creation of a national strategic fleet, including a fleet of container ships to develop Australia's domestic and international shipping capability. Our view is consistent with the views expressed by the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, the Honourable Barnaby Joyce, who in an interview reported in the media in July when he returned to the Cabinet, said that he backed the creation of a fleet of Australian flag merchant ships to back the nation, to make the nation more self-reliant, and stated that Australian ships Australia needed Australian flag ships to have full sovereignty and stated that Australia needs its own shipping capacity. So we are yet to see the terms of reference for the Productivity Commission inquiry into the efficiency of the maritime logistics system, foreshadowed in a speech by the Prime Minister last week, but we hope those terms of reference are sufficiently broad to enable the issues raised by the Deputy Prime Minister to be addressed. Australia is not capturing the benefits from being a shipping-dependent nation. There is considerable innovation occurring in ports and inland terminals, in ship design, in transport fuels, in shipbuilding, in logistic technologies, but it is not being supported by government, nor is it coordinated. Australia should be extracting economic benefit from the shipping aspects of supply chains to build the nation's comparative advantage in shipping for national economic gain and reduce the drain on the balance of payments and purchases of overseas shipping services. In 1819, shipping services was the 7th largest Australian import, costing the nation $10 billion. At the same time, Australia's export of shipping services was valued at just 177 million. So clearly that needs to be addressed. And that's obviously noted by the fact that these global container shipping lines are price gouging and raking in the billions of dollars at the expense of Australian consumers. So we can do this if we take advantage of emerging manufacturing and supply chain opportunities. The growth, expansion and transformation of Australian manufacturing is intimately linked to emerging opportunities for Australian ships, notwithstanding the National Shipping and Maritime Industry Policy Framework is not geared to take advantage of emerging sea transportation opportunities that could provide a role for more Australian ships with substantially greater maritime employment. And there are a number of emerging industries and new technologies such as automation and digitalisation and business development in areas such as expedition cruise shipping, aquaculture and bunkering of alternate marine propulsion fuels that can be captured. The emerging industrial transformation trajectory in Australia could see a renaissance of shipping over the next several decades with the right policy support. Importantly, in the manufacturing sense and the supply chains that go with it, we think Australian support for Australian ships is good for Australian jobs. For every Australian crude trading ship creates a minimum of 34 direct seafaring jobs, and through the multiplier effect, another 30 to 40 jobs in onshore ship support services and jobs along the transport supply chain. We also think that new industries such as offshore wind turbines could create manufacturing in the componentry space, and of course the wind towers, which would ideally help create Australian shipping with those particular inputs that are required in the commodities that are required for manufacturing broadly. Over that period of time, 2,500 direct seafaring jobs would be created over the next 5 to 10 years if we had that government support, and around 3,600 indirect onshore maritime jobs for a total of 6,000 new maritime jobs in total. Finally, I'd like to make a final point that is important that policy and programs to support the revival and transition of Australian manufacturing are fully integrated with supply chain policy and program support. Not only will that create a more efficient and productive manufacturing industry, but will extract economic benefit along with supply chain security and resilience by creating a national shipping industry. So thank you for your time. That's my opening statement, Senator.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Newlyn. Whilst I was reading your submission, it took me back. I come from the mining industry originally. 25 years ago, I went to the launching of a vessel called the MV Aburi, which is a self-loading, self-discharging vessel which operates out of a port called Bing Bong in the Gulf of Carpentaria and takes lead zinc concentrate from that port to a deep sea anchorage point. And that vessel was designed in Australia, it was manufactured in Australia, and that was an Australian project, first-class Australian project, innovation, fit for purpose, it assisted the country to liberate value from a relatively isolated mining deposit. Is that one of the areas we should really be focusing on in this regard, in terms of using our innovation, our expertise, and also coming up with vessel design, architecture, naval architecture that actually can help us solve some of the specific issues, physical issues we have in Australia, and make us more productive?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like a perfect Dorothy Dixon question for me.
I did my best, Mr. Newlyn.
We feel that Australia has, well, it certainly has, and has a history of a shipbuilding nation and shipbuilding capacity, and that ties into this manufacturing inquiry, because Australian manufacturing can do several things in terms of shipbuilding. We have the ship capacities. We've seen that in the naval shipbuilding area and submarines. But as you indicated, the Aburi, I think one of the last vessels to be built in Australia was if it wasn't that one, it was the Aurora Australis, who at Port Jackson, Newcastle. And we've sort of lost that broader capability, but it is an area, given we're an island nation, that we should be focusing attention. Not only does that then create export opportunity for Australia, but it creates that manufacturing hub in different communities and areas around Australia to support the Australian economy. And broadly, hopefully, they're things that we can export as well, as we see with some of the smaller domestic commercial vessel infrastructure and building that goes on in Australia currently.
And I would have thought with our Pacific Step Up program, where we're engaging more and more with our Pacific family of nations, that there's opportunities there as well for us to develop bespoke vessels that suit the particular requirements of our Pacific family, to help them come up with transport solutions which suit their particular circumstances. Is that a fair comment as well?
Yeah, it is, and we've been promoting for some time what we refer to as short sea shipping. That is, Australia could be a hub for the Pacific and even Papua New Guinea, etc. From the larger hubs of Singapore and China, for instance. So they're all opportunities that should be taken, that are currently done by foreign flag shipping, could easily be done and supported with Australian ships in a perhaps bipartisan way, or through the Pacific, where we share vessels and or have two different services that support the Pacific generally.
Chair, Senator Patrick here. You clearly haven't read the government's memo where they're buying our Pacific Step Up ship from overseas.
Oh, well, okay, Senator Patrick, you know me, I ask my own questions.
I'm very pleased.
And I guess, Mr. Newlyn, this is important as well, because not only is it important that we keep these maritime skills within our own country and build upon them, but we also reach out to our Pacific neighbours so that they can leverage off our skills and technical qualifications and develop them in-house as well. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Australia has supported Pacific and other countries around the world with our Australian Maritime College in development of maritime skills. So there's certainly a commercial aspect, I suppose, for training. Those opportunities have presented themselves before. But in a manufacturing sense, I think our submission goes to the fact that in the broader, larger context of either refining, milling, and development of aluminium product or steel products, then Australian ships should be carting and carrying our own, inputs. So that's iron ore or coal for smelters, etc., to do that work, and then carry the finished product to export market.
Yeah, and there's a real issue around sovereign capability in that regard too, isn't there? Because I think in your submission, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was quite staggered actually that I think you said there are only 4 vessels left, that trading vessels operating out of Australia. Is that right?
It's 4 international vessels.
4 international vessels.
They're the gas LNG carriers out of northwestern Australia. Pretty much we don't have a international fleet at all anymore in this country. I went to sea in 1988. We had 100 Australian ships. We had about 17 Australian tankers. Now we don't have any, and we're heavily reliant on international refining, and every drop of fuel that's delivered around Australia is delivered on a foreign flag vessel. So that's no good for our supply chain sovereignty at all.
So we've gone from 100 at the time of our bicentenary in 1988 to 4.
Oh, sorry, once there were 100, there was 100 Australian flag vessels. Of those trading overseas, we probably had 15.
Right.
And to 20. That's just off the top of my head. I can't
Right.
give a
Okay.
precise number on that.
And that's notwithstanding the fact that we constitute 10% of the world sea trade.
Yeah, we're the 4th largest user of ships in the world, Australia. So we're a bit bigger than the 10th.
Right. Okay.
Largest. So we're shipping out with all our iron ore, coal, bulk commodities. We're in comparison a very large user of ships in this country.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I'll now share the call with Senator Pratt. Are you there?
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the Maritime Union for your very helpful submission. In terms of how we get on a path to move to having our own local shipping, national shipping capacity, what are the first steps we need to take as a nation in order to overcome that current foreign dependence that we have? How do we unscramble this egg one step at a time? I can see, you've highlighted a shipping policy framework, integrating it into the modern manufacturing strategy, infrastructure and innovation. Are there some initial government decisions that demonstrate that we are prepared to unscramble this egg?
Yeah, great question, Senator. The first step would be some legislative or regulatory change that promotes and utilises or gives the industry support to Australian ship owners to invest. What we're seeing is that it's so uncompetitive for an Australian ship owner or operator to go out and purchase or build a vessel that they can't compete with the foreign flag ships in our area. So we've put forward a large suite of policies that cross, I guess, many portfolios in government, because it's a sum of all parts game to reintroduce Australian shipping in a way that sort of supports the nation and builds on our supply chain resilience. And there's no one critical area. I could easily say that we shouldn't provide, or we should have amendments to the Maritime Cruise Visa system that doesn't just give you unfettered access to foreign seafarers and allow an Australian operator then to contend or contest those particular trades where historically, over many years, Australian ships have traded, and that's the normal cabotage trade, carrying Australian cargoes from one port to another Australian port on an Australian ship. That's almost decimated.
There's a global reputation in this industry for cost-cutting cowboys. Are there countries that are doing this well, and what benefits are they getting from doing that in terms of their supply chain reliability
I think
and
thanks
or
for the
capacity?
question, Sarah. I think the US does it the best. They have the gold standard. Not only do they have their act is called the Jones Act. Not only does that act allow for American vessels to trade across the American states, it also requires the manufacture of those vessels in America. So it's a whole manufacturing strategy that goes along with the cabotage or the supply chain sovereignty aspects of that. And it's also another pillar of defence to some degree. They provide auxiliary services to the armed forces, which is another element. Those vessels can be requisitioned in time of need for American purposes. And likewise, in some of our other submissions in other areas around shipping, we've said the same. The government should support or develop industry support packages that provide, it's not saying the government need to build the ships, but private enterprise can do it. But at any point, the government needs, to requisition a vessel. It could be a flood, could be the bushfires, it could be, support for our Pacific partners. In an environmental catastrophe, then those vessels can be requisitioned.
Who currently owns and controls the majority of vessels in terms of, there must be other nations and the flag bearers that have control of those vessels. That essentially means they wouldn't be at Australia's beck and call in that time of.
Yeah, it's a massive problem. I mean, the issue with shipping generally is that, global shipping is flag of convenience ships, and it's such a difficult question to answer because often in flag of convenience vessels, you don't know who the beneficial owner of that vessel is. It's generally in a $2 shelf company. They're registered in the Panama or Liberia. That's why they're called flags of convenience.
Convenience, yeah.
No tax. So the vessel sometimes could be beneficially owned, I don't know, let's say in Japan, registered in Liberia and crewed out of the Philippines, for instance, and it's sometimes very difficult to find.
So in terms of global movements, a sovereign supply chain would be of, would be of great benefit. Has the US specifically regulated to keep those ships out? Yes,
they are. So they have legislation that prevents other vessels carrying cargo. I suppose there may be some exemptions, but overwhelmingly American vessels transport American goods around American ports.
So how do we move from that, that global lack of regulation to bringing better standards in, both in terms of rights for personnel on those ships?
Well, it has to be a regulatory
isolating our own industries that need to export, that step-by-step shift.
Yeah, again, thanks for the question. I think it certainly needs a greater regulatory influence.
Yeah.
Currently, we have a global supply chain crisis. We have ship owners global ship owners that are, price gouging. They're making it more difficult for Australian consumers. I think what COVID has identified is that we do need our own sovereign capability in a number of different areas, and hence why this inquiry into manufacturing is going on. The fact that we are historically, or in the most recent decades, been the world's mine for a number of different things. And then what's essentially happening is the owner of the particular cargo, so it's iron ore, or the purchaser of the cargo is supplying the vessels, and a freight on board type arrangement. So they control which vessel is being utilised, what those vessels are being paid, the types of vessels, and if it's not for our regulatory landscape, it makes it even more difficult. So we have the safety regulator, Australian Maritime Safety Authority, that doesn't have the capacity or the funding, in our view, to be able to inspect a lot of these vessels. Many go unchecked.
Yeah.
So we need to develop a regulatory framework that allows, particularly even the transportation of Australian goods around Australia on Australian vessels, the opportunity for Australian ship owners to participate in that place, in that space on a level playing field.
Thank you. In terms of, there's a movement in relation to slavery in manufactured goods where we're auditing the supply chain. How well are those audits being applied in that national framework currently to shipping in terms of disclosure and transparency?
Transparency in shipping, shipping is like the dark art. It's a dark industry. No one sees it. Your goods just turn up and people don't really pay it too much attention. I touched base on AMSA in my last response, and they are the regulator in this space. There is an international convention called the Maritime Labour Convention that ship owners must comply with. However, given the nature of international shipping, there are a lot of cowboys out there, and sometimes they try to manipulate the system and double bookkeep and do a whole host of things in that space. So the regulatory space is very difficult to lock down on. Some of the big shippers, such as BHP, Rio Tinto, FMG, etc., go through some processes to try and mitigate those problems, but it's not an exact science, and many ship owners try and avoid wherever they can. The other interesting facet in that space, Senator, is that during COVID, foreign seafarers in particular have probably been the most disadvantaged. Most contracts for international seafarers are about 10 to 11 months at sea. During COVID, they were locked up and extended in that period for up to 2 years. Australia allowed, through AMSA, seafarers to do 14 months. But then, of course, that had to be extended because we wouldn't allow foreign seafarers to vacate those vessels and or be allowed to fly for Australian airports. So some were stuck on board for up to 2 years in very trying circumstances, given they couldn't go ashore in any port in the world, pretty much.
So in that context, we've been part of trapping those seafarers on their ships as they've moved between ports in Australia. Whereas if you had a sovereign capability where you had Australians crewing those ships travelling between ports, we would have been able to do so in a more COVID-safe environment.
Yeah, without a doubt. Absolutely.
Thanks. That's very helpful context in terms of both our sovereign capability and our own capacity to move goods, as well as, those, the rights of those trapped on board. A slightly tangential question in the context of ship building and breaking, the labour standards for breaking up ships. I know that's not your core business, but they're done, we tend to think of manufacturing as the creation of goods, but now it's the whole of the supply chain. Do you happen to know where our ships go to be broken up? I know defence likes to blow them up and sink them, but that's less sustainable, less acceptable these days.
Yeah.
I know that the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union have said we've got to become more accountable for that part of the supply chain as well.
Yeah, I agree with that totally, and I think there are many opportunities. Currently, most vessels are broken up in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and some in India, and obviously in very poor conditions. So not the best area of the supply chain to be focusing on, but there are opportunities in Australia given the offshore oil and gas decommissioning that has been announced. I think that, well, the estimate is it's a $50 billion industry in itself, where offshore platforms will need to be decommissioned. We think there's an opportunity there, and as I imagine the AMWU would, and the manufacturing unions, to dismantle those offshore facilities in Australia and recycle those assets as best as possible in areas that we support. So I think there's a great opportunity for Australian manufacturing in that space, in the recycling of those assets as a new industry. And as I said, there's estimates that there's $50 billion in offshore oil and gas assets that need to be decommissioned and recycled, oil wells plugged, etc., that will create significant activity and employment activity and economic outcome as well. So I think that's a positive aspect of the reverse of manufacturing, but opportunities nevertheless.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your evidence today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Senator Pratt. Mr. Newlyn, I just had one other area I wanted to ask some questions of you in relation to, and that is an issue that's been raised with me by some stakeholders, that there was a change in policy about 2010 or so in relation to surveying requirements for vessels, so that, as I understand it, in the past, AMSA accredited surveyors could conduct surveys of vessels that were only used in a domestic context, and the additional cost of having to use IACS surveyors was avoided. And one stakeholder has advised me that change in policy, where they're no longer permitted to use state AMSA accredited surveyors, can add something like $400,000 to the cost of a 50-metre vessel, say a ferry that's just going to be operated within Australian waters. Are you aware of that issue in terms of it adding costs to manufacturing in Australia in the shipbuilding industry?
No, I'm not familiar with that specifically, but this was a deregulated process in about 2012, where the state jurisdictions, where they were trying to harmonise all the maritime jurisdictions under the domestic commercial vessel legislation. The states used to do that work. They used to do the surveying of that work, do the crewing numbers and all those things. And now that's been, I guess, outsourced and deregulated to some extent. But I couldn't tell you precisely that it adds that sort of cost. I wouldn't have thought that would be the case, although they are responsible, those surveyors are responsible to the AMSA standards. But I'm unsure of that sort of figure, to be honest.
Okay, that's okay. I just wanted to check with you. Thanks very much for your evidence. It's greatly appreciated, and thank you very much for your
Chair. Could I just ask one question?
Oh, sure, Senator Kitching.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Newlyn. Could I just ask you, so what sort of financial, regulatory or taxation support would you like to see introduced to support the industry and to increase supply chain resilience? I note that you've argued in your submission about the industry support package, but could you maybe just expand on that a little, if that's possible?
Well, we think generally, in terms of the taxation arrangement for seafarers, at the moment we're not getting any tax from foreign seafarers who are operating, in Australia. There are some vessels, for instance, that are, I know for one that operates from Hobart in Risdon to Port Pirie in South Australia, has been doing for 10 years with, foreign crew. That is a domestic supply chain area that should be an Australian ship. So we argue that taxation exemption should occur for some seafarers to an extent, because that money will be coming back into the country in terms of GST revenue and others, and it's not something the government would have ordinarily missed out on. So there are opportunities there. That would be, again, an area that makes it more tangible for an Australian ship owner to invest in Australian registered ships and to give opportunities and employment to Australians in that space. So that would be one area, Senator. And there are a host of others that indirectly could impact, but some of that, and this is where we say some of it's not integrated across the states and federal government, is that you have areas where, for instance, the Victorian government or the Queensland government might subsidise power for a smelter or something like that. But there's no quid pro quo. Nothing comes back to say support the outputs for an Australian ship, which would only be a couple of million difference between the foreign flag, foreign crew component to an Australian crew component. Yet, a government might support a smelter, for instance, by a couple $100 million as an energy subsidy.
Great, thank you. And supply chain resilience would be increased. I guess it makes it more viable, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, I guess the other area, and this is the key component at the moment of why a strategic Australian fleet is so necessary, and I touched on it in my opening statement. We see it in the container trade at the moment, that vessels, owners of these vessels are going into more lucrative trades, say China to the US or China to Europe or elsewhere, leaving Australian consumers in a lag because A, we can't get containers, or B, they're not sending ships down to collect empty containers to take back to China or wherever else we're importing goods from. And that creates an issue for us. Equally, cost of fuel's going up. An overseas operator, a BP or a Shell or someone could send their tankers to Timbuktu as opposed to Australia because they get a better price for the oil or the refined product, depending on the nature and where it's going. So there are many opportunities and reasons why we should have a strategic fleet.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Thank you. There was much food for thought in your submission, so thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kitching, and thank you, Mr. Newlyn. That was very, very useful. If you could now log out that